So welcome to our section on Turn Back the Clock, where we look at times in history where we might be able to learn something about how humanity has managed to keep surviving, so far at least. And I'm here today with historian Frank Gavin, who has written a new book, The Taming of Scarcity and the Problems of Plenty, Rethinking International Relations and American Grand Strategy in a New Era, which deals with some problems very relevant to our discussion, including pandemics and climate change as problems of plenty. And Frank is also an expert on nuclear history, something that the European Leadership Network is extremely interested in. So Frank, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
I'd like to start by asking you, what can we learn from looking back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when the world confronted the first man-made existential threat? How was it possible to get enough international cooperation to prevent nuclear weapons spreading to all countries?
Well, Jane, it's a great question. And I would have to say, if you were looking in the 1950s through even the early 1960s, there was not a lot of hope for international cooperation on nuclear weapons. People had basically assumed that the way world politics worked was that nuclear weapons would spread. There was very little you could do to prevent other nations from getting this technology, which would take care of their most basic problem, which was guaranteeing their survival and their security. And there was very little in history to indicate that one or a group of states could keep other states from acquiring this technology. And in fact, American policy and Western policy had been to hope that other states wouldn't acquire these weapons, but a sort of fatalism, an assumption that they would. The Eisenhower administration has spent some time trying to keep France from getting nuclear weapons. They'd failed, and they ended up both with a nuclear France and a France that was upset at the United States for trying. So there were many people who thought this was a pointless endeavor and, in fact, a harmful endeavor. And you saw people like Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, saying not only can we not prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, we should perhaps get ahead of the curve and provide nuclear weapons to our friends and allies, countries like India or Japan. And there have been a group of policymakers within the Johnson administration who rejected that view and made the case that, in fact, pursuing non-proliferation, trying to prevent states from getting nuclear weapons, while it would be costly, while it would not be easy, was worth doing. And there was this extraordinary debate within the Johnson administration that followed China's detonation of a nuclear device in October 1964. When China went nuclear, they were considered the ultimate rogue regime. There was concern that states throughout the world would develop these nuclear weapons. President Johnson commissioned a top secret committee to study the issue, chaired by previous Undersecretary of Defense Ross Kilpatrick. And they recommended that the United States pursue non-aggression aggressively. Now, in order to do this, you basically had to work with your enemy, the Soviet Union, at the expense of your close friends, which was not easy to accept. You had to go to your allies like West Germany, like Japan, and others and say, you couldn't have this weapon, and you had to work with the Soviet Union in order to do it. And Great Britain was very involved in this as well, and this led to the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was wildly successful, far more successful than anyone would have expected. And again, it was premised on some uncomfortable compromises, working with an ideological and geopolitical enemy to make this happen, working often against the interests of your friends, offering expensive security guarantees to countries that you may not have wanted to, and creating a treaty that we all recognize as being inherently unfair. Certain states kept nuclear weapons, others didn't get it. But it was wildly successful. I don't think anyone, if you had told somebody in 1961 or 62 that in 2024 there would be 9 nuclear weapon states, a decrease in the amount of strategic nuclear weapons and no nuclear weapons used, they would have said, that sounds like a miracle. How do I sign up? And so that's why it's one of the most extraordinary stories of the second part of the 20th century.
I think it's so valuable to get that perspective today, because today I think we are seeing some pessimism about the state of this treaty, and there are those that would say it's just a matter of time. You'll see Iran, Saudi Arabia, maybe South Korea, others going for this weapon. Do you think that this is a repeat of the same mistaken fatalism, or are the risks now more serious?
Well, I think there is always pressure on the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And you're correct to point out that there's a lot of discussion of various states looking to develop their own independent nuclear weapons. But if you look, there were times in the 1970s when the regime was under pressure. There was times in the 90s when India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons. There were times in the aughts when North Korea was developing nuclear weapons. It's what makes the treaty and the regime so impressive and unusual, because it is, to a certain extent, unnatural. It's natural for states to want to protect themselves. It's natural for states not to rely on others for their protection or to trust treaties. It's natural for them to want the most cutting-edge technology. So it's a hard treaty. It's a difficult treaty, but it's well worth maintaining. It's been pressured before. It'll be pressured again. But I wouldn't say the pressure today is any greater than it was than when India and Pakistan tested, when North Korea tested, and in the 1970s when countries like South Korea and Taiwan had secret nuclear weapons programs. And so it requires commitment. And the other thing I would say is that I think that in a way that I certainly find surprising, but states actually prefer to live in a world where they can avoid developing their own nuclear weapons. States would prefer to live in a world where either they didn't face the security challenges that necessitated it, or were part of security arrangements, either in an alliance or with the United States, where their security didn't necessitate them getting nuclear weapons. So even though there are pressures, most states in the system want to see it continue.
Another area of cooperation that you've mentioned previously is the smallpox vaccination campaign during the Cold War. And I wondered if you could say a bit about how that became possible during a time of such acute geopolitical competition.
Sure. And this is the great expert on this is a historian at Harvard named Erez Manela, who's written just an absolutely terrific series of articles on this. And it's a little different than the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was decided by leaders at the top with political decisions. Smallpox eradication was more international organizations and mid-level experts working together. And of course, this was a period when there was a variety of interesting and successful efforts, some of the malaria eradication, some of the issues involving agriculture and the Green Revolution. But what it demonstrated, we often, particularly in this day and age, don't give international organizations and UN organizations a lot of credit. And the World Health Organization certainly held in lower esteem than it once was. But this was one of the great products of the sort of fruition of international organizations from the UN system after World War II. And you had something like the World Health Organization, where public health and medical experts from around the world were able to put aside ideology and political differences and say, hey, this is something we can cooperate on. This is something we can work on together. It needed political cover, but medical experts and public health experts were able to work together, receive the political support, and end up pursuing policies that ended up saving tens of millions of lives. It's really extraordinary. And a great model, I think, for today.
And today, a lot of people are feeling more gloomy about the state of multilateralism. You know, what advice would you have for people who want to promote policies that require international cooperation? How can you persuade people? What organisations can you work through? What can we learn from the past to help us deal with these issues?
We're in a challenging time, and one of the slight differences between today and the middle of the 1960s was in the middle of the 1960s, the geopolitical and ideological competition of the Cold War, which was intense and far more terrifying than anything we face today, there had been a real scare moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people had gone to the precipice and they realized that if they didn't come up with some understandings, that they could blow up the planet. And so you had this moment in the sort of early, mid, and late 1960s where even though both the superpowers recognized they had these geopolitical differences and ideological differences, they had to find a way to get along. There's the famous speech President Kennedy gave in the summer of 1963 at American University, where he essentially said, our main responsibility is to make sure as two superpowers we don't blow up the planet. And we haven't achieved that moment yet, particularly between the United States and China, but also with the war in Ukraine. And it would be nice if we could live in a world almost where you could have the simulation of the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis to wake people up without having to go through it. I do think there are people both in Beijing and Washington and London and other capitals who are realizing that the stresses of particularly the US-China competition could result in dangerous outcomes, and that there's more to be gained from cooperation, because most of these planetary challenges that we face, climate, public health, inequality, emerging technology, they actually can't be managed without the United States and China having some level of cooperation. And you see little bits and pieces of it here. Great Britain hosted the AI summit late last fall, and China was invited. You see hints of some cooperation between China and the United States and others on that. But I think it's just recognizing that geopolitical and ideological competition may persist, but that should not preclude working together on these challenges that face all of us, which are frankly far more threatening in many ways than the geopolitical ones.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Frank, and thank you for putting it so beautifully. It's been great to have your insights. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.